now happy to recognize my friend, Buddy Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here and for participating in what is truly an extremely important subject matter. And you know, this is bipartisan. This should concern all of us, and I think it does concern all of us. Let me begin by saying that social media companies have moved to more aggressively moderate and police the content on their platforms, but the approaches vary significantly. While some of the efforts are able to go after accounts and posts that clearly violate their terms, they also ignore or refuse to take down other content. For example, Twitter refused earlier this year to remove a tweet by Iran's supreme leader which called for the destruction and genocide of the Israeli people. Twitter responded that these tweets were not in violation of their policies. I want to start with you, Mr. Donahue, and ask you, can you explain to me as best you can how some platforms maintain policies that are inconsistent and create more problems?
So while I am not a coder, I understand what is being published online in those forums. Their content and their individual corporate terms of service, which people who post on it are free to do so and accept those terms of service. But they vary based on both the platform, the jurisdiction where they are incorporated, and what's supposed to be driving their profit motives. And I listened to Ambassador Ginsburg and Mr. Kendall very clearly that it's the profit motive that drives it. And when you look at hyperbolic statements like the one you just spoke about, and yet having a response, I take it at its face value, that they said, no, that doesn't violate our terms of service and our posting, that's a real concern. And we've seen it with respect to things that are happening here in the U.S. And I could expand upon that with regard to extremist, disturbing content about advocating the murder of police officers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Mr. Ginsburg, let me ask you, anti-Semitism is a problem that continues to show its head. It's more than a problem. It's awful, and it's something we need to eliminate. How can these anti-Semitic posts be rationalized as not being in violation of Twitter's rules? I don't get it. Can you explain that to me?
They make it up as they go along, Congressman. I mean, depending on the prevailing winds and the amount of pressure on them, most of what we see in terms of, for example, anti-Semitism right now is emerging from QAnon accounts, which itself has a major component of anti-Semitism in it. And the real problem here is that each of these companies have their own terms of service, and they decipher them and interpret them as they want, which is one of the reasons why I said in my testimony, we're calling for the creation of a social media standards board that would create a harmonized code of conduct across the industry that was modeled after the 1970s Financial Accounting Service Board that harmonized all of the different standards that the banking industry had.
Let me ask you something. I'll start with you, Mr. Donahue, but I'd also like Mr. Ginsburg to respond to this. Is there any telltale characteristics that of users that can help to identify some of these things, some of these posts? Are there any consistencies there?
So one of the things that's really complicated, and we've seen this in some of the work that I did with the Network Contagion Research Institute, is that it's the context in which things are said, and that really requires talented analysts. In my prepared testimony, it's the idea that while concerning content can be somewhat understood by some of the technologies that the companies have put in place, it also requires eyes on, and that's why the coded messages, a very disturbing message that was posted on December 20th, 2014, before the assassination of 2 New York City police officers, was a text that was a social media post by the assassin that said, "Let's go put some wings on pigs." And that wasn't picked up because it wasn't contextualized beforehand. So it's the idea that people have to put eyes on it to understand what it means.
Mr. Ginsburg?
I just want to add very quickly, Congressman, that one of the things that we see in the spread of anti-Semitism on social media is the enormous role that fringe, deep and dark web chat rooms and messaging boards play in promoting anti-Semitism onto major social media platforms. I don't know if you're familiar with Gab or 8KUN or the other fringe boards that have become safe havens for white nationalist neo-Nazi groups, which of course are not the attention of this hearing, but I want to assure you are just as responsible for the spread of anti-Semitism into our mainstream discourse than anything else.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your participation. I yield back.